Welcome to lecture number 103. This is historical topic 9.5, Migration and Immigration in the 1990s and 2000s. The theme is Migration and Settlement. There is just one learning objective, and that is explain the causes and effects of domestic and international migration over time. The first key concept covers internal migration, and it says, after 1980, the political, economic, and cultural influence of the American South and West continued to increase as population shifted to those areas. The Northeast and the Midwest continued to lose population to the South and West in this period, and it has political consequences. The top electoral map shows each state's size in proportion to the number of electoral votes they hold. Every 10 years, there is a census taken in the United States, and based on the population shifts, the states with a growing population are awarded more representation in Congress at the expense of those with a shrinking population or those with the smallest rate of growth. That reapportionment made the states of Florida very important, especially in the 2000 election. Florida has 29 electoral votes, and it's generally thought to be a swing state, a state that could feasibly be won by either the Democratic or the Republican Party. In the 2000 presidential election, the state of Florida was the last contested because of various recounts that were ordered. The final tally had a difference of just 537 votes between the eventual winner, Republican George W. Bush, and the Democrat Al Gore. There's also an economic influence that's responsible for the migrations. States in the South and the West were trying to attract businesses through low taxes and anti-union laws. Coupled with good climate, it made for an attractive place to relocate businesses. Additionally, the Jim Crow era was pretty much dismantled with all de jure discrimination eradicated by federal law or the Supreme Court. Businesses no longer had to worry about maintaining a system of segregation mandated by state laws. However, there are still residual effects of that segregation and discrimination, and they persist into the present day. The cultural influence of the South and the West grew in this period too. Various cultural elements that emerged from the South and were adopted by the rest of the country includes country music. It's a genre of music that is no longer exclusively listened to by Southern audiences. Evangelical Christianity is also big in the South. The Southeast of the United States is sometimes referred to as the Bible Belt. Religion is quite important to the southern region of the United States, and during presidential elections, candidates who are trying to sway Southern voters will sometimes adopt the support for evangelism. In the Southwest, there's also a lot of Latin American immigrants. Therefore, Roman Catholicism has become a bigger religion in that region. In the West Coast, in California, the center of the music and the movie industry increases the cultural influence the Sun Belt has on the rest of the country. Movie producers in Hollywood and music producers in Los Angeles have a huge say in what movies and music gets made to be consumed by national audiences. The second and last key concept covers international migration. It says international migration from Latin America and Asia increased dramatically. The new immigrants affected U.S. culture in many ways and supplied the economy with an important labor force. After the 1965 Immigration Act was signed, the expected immigration from Europe never came about. Definitely not at the levels that they were expecting before the 1921 and 1924 Quota Acts. Instead, immigration from other countries that hadn't previously migrated to the United States, like Asian countries, are the ones that have higher rates of immigration to the U.S. Immigration to the U.S. is very important because without it, the U.S. would have a declining population. The problems associated with a declining population are visible in other countries with post-industrial economies that are now aging populations. They've developed problems with their social safety net because there's not enough workers paying into the tax system to take care of the elderly. So without international migration, the U.S. would probably have already run out of money in the Social Security Trust. That's one key economic impact of immigration to the United States. Like mentioned earlier, migrants from Asia make up one of the largest migrant groups. Today, they make up about 6.5% of the total population. Because the standards for applying and getting approved for a visa to move to the United States from the 1965 legislation, it resulted in an immigrant population that was highly educated or wealthy. It created the model minority myth that all Asian Americans or Asian migrants are either very wealthy or very smart. The majority of Asian people in the U.S. live mostly on the West Coast. California and Hawaii have the highest percentage of them in their populations. This is partly because new Asian migrants settle in the U.S. in places with economic opportunity. This new Asian population is also counted with the number of Asian Americans that have been in the U.S. for many generations, predating the Chinese Exclusion Act, and most of those Asian Americans are located in California and Hawaii. At present, there is the issue of anti-Asian hate crimes. From 2020 to 2021, hate crimes against Asian Americans went up 161% from 279 to 746. This was partly due to the coronavirus pandemic. Since the virus originated in China, there was a growing nativist sentiment that blamed all Asians or Asian Americans for the spread of the virus. The campaign Stop AAPI Hate was created in response to the growing violence and prejudice. Latin American migration is the other international migration group mentioned by the key concept. Unlike Asian immigration, the 1965 Immigration Act restricted migration for Latin American migrants. That is because the previous 1924 Quota Acts did not apply to migration from the Western Hemisphere. In 1965, Latin American countries were capped at 20,000 visas, just like all other countries. The Bracero program, which brought Mexican guest workers to work in agriculture, had ended just a year earlier as well. Coming into the United States was now harder for Latin American migrants who were previously births of passage or seasonal migrants. Once they came into the US, they were less likely to go back now to their home country. Additionally, the cap on migration didn't eliminate people's need to work or the agriculture industry's labor cap, so there was an increase in illegal crossings. One major immigration event from Latin America was the 1980 Mariel boat lift, which originated in Cuba. Fidel Castro gave temporary permission for Cubans who wanted to leave the islands to do so without issue. Close to 125,000 Cubans who were unhappy with the communist regime left and arrived in the US. Most had family or contacts in the US and resettled. A small percentage of them were never allowed entrance because they lacked a sponsor, proper entry papers, or had served time in Cuban prison for petty crimes. A rumor that Castro had emptied Cuba's prisons as part of the Mariel boat lift generated nativist sentiment in the US. While President Carter proclaimed the US would welcome them with open arms and open hearts, that was not always the case. The number of undocumented migrants rose so much that by 1986, Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act. The Reagan administration was looking to implement a new way to enforce immigration policies, but in order to implement them, he had to compromise with the pro-immigration faction in Congress. In order to get his reforms, Reagan agreed to create a system for amnesty and a path to citizenship for people who arrived prior to 1982 and met other criteria. Reagan's reforms included measures for increased border security, but its main provision was to shift enforcement of immigration policy to private businesses. Employers were now responsible for ensuring that those they hired were legally able to work in the US. If they hired anyone without proper documentation, businesses would get fined. Later, Bill Clinton in 1996 signed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which restricted public benefits for undocumented migrants and made it more difficult for an undocumented migrant to gain legal status in the US. Suffice to say that these measures did not curb illegal immigration in any significant way, and Latin American migrants and Hispanic Americans currently make up the fastest growing population segment in the US. That will continue to be the case through at least the next 10 years. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals is an executive order signed by President Obama in 2012 meant to target a part of undocumented migration. It was meant to decriminalize the children and minors who came with their parents to the United States in an undocumented manner. These children would go to American schools, learn English, grow up in the United States, and then when they're older, find out that they didn't have legal status. DACA was meant to protect these children or these people who came to the US when they were children and had no other choice but to follow their parents. DACA gives them at least a path to creating some type of life in the US in which they do not have to worry about being deported. It allows people who came as children to study in colleges, work legally, get driver's licenses, pay taxes, and all without the fear of deportation. They have to renew their DACA status every so often and it costs about $500. They're able to do all of this as long as they stay out of trouble with the law. Finally, at the end of this, they cannot receive federal benefits like Social Security and Medicare at the end of their working life, so there is a big trade-off. In 2017, President Trump tried to repeal DACA and the NAACP came to the defense of these mostly Latin American migrants. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court eventually said that the reasoning and the process for the repeal of DACA was flawed. They did not deny that the Department of Homeland Security had the prerogative to end DACA, but the reason and the processes that they followed were not proper processes, so for that reason, the people who had registered under DACA were allowed to continue to stay in the United States. Finally, here is the recap. The American South and West gain influence due to demographic shifts towards the region, and immigration continues to be important for population growth and cultural diffusion. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.